Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores experience and meaning and their impact on individuals and the broader society. You might remember me mentioning the Haymarket Affair in a past episode, or maybe not. Honestly, I talk about a lot of things, so let's just do a quick recap. The Haymarket Affair happened back in May of 1886 in Chicago. It started as a peaceful rally in Haymarket Square. Workers were striking for an 8-hour workday. The day before, there'd been a violent clash at the McCormick plant where police had killed 2 protesters, so tensions were already high. Then, during the rally, someone, no one knows who, threw a dynamite bomb into the crowd just as police were trying to break things up. Chaos broke out. The explosion and the gunfire that followed killed 7 cops and at least 4 civilians, with a bunch more people injured. In the aftermath, 8 anarchists were arrested and charged with conspiracy. And here's the kicker. None of them actually threw the bomb, and only 2 of them were even there when it happened. Still, 7 were sentenced to death, and 1 got 15 years. 2 of the death sentences were later reduced, 1 man took his own life in jail, and 4 were executed. Years later, in 1893, the governor of Illinois pardoned the last surviving defendant and basically called the whole trial a sham. The Haymarket Affair became a pivotal moment for the labor movement and led to May 1 being recognized as International Workers' Day. Today, the site is a Chicago landmark, and the memorial for the defendants is a National Historic Landmark. So this event, understandably, hit people in very different ways. In the last episode, I talked about Lolita LeBron and how her activism was rooted deeply in labor and working class struggle here in the U.S. That's a through line that I've been following lately, how these systems of oppression stack up and how people, especially women, push back. I mentioned how, in the U.S., we often frame women's empowerment in terms of how well a woman can succeed inside a system that was never built by or for her. We hold up women who manage to play the game well instead of women who flip the board. And I really do think that framing is intentional. Not by most of us, not by average people, but by the system itself, because it benefits when we think empowerment looks like assimilation instead of disruption. That's what led me down this path to look at disruptive women. This week, we're talking about one of the loudest disruptors of her time, Emma Goldman. And when I say loud, I mean loud enough that J. Edgar Hoover called her one of the most dangerous anarchists in America. That's not exactly an award he handed out lightly. So what did she do that was so terrifying? She dared to question everything. The draft, the government, the church, the marriage institution, capitalism, prisons, you name it. She was a champion of free speech, birth control, free love, LGBTQ rights, and labor organizing. She didn't want a seat at the table. She wanted to flip the table over and build something better. These views earned her the nickname Red Emma, and eventually got her deported to Russia in 1919. Some people saw her as a visionary, a free-thinking rebel woman. Others painted her as a dangerous radical. And yeah, she supported political violence in certain contexts, especially as a response to state violence. She wasn't about half measures. Her speeches and writing covered everything from the brutality of prisons to the lies of capitalism, and she never backed down. She distanced herself from mainstream suffrage movements, not because she didn't believe in women's rights, but because she thought voting alone wasn't going to change a broken system. She believed in a deeper, more radical kind of liberation. And while her name might not get that mainstream love that some other historical figures do, her legacy is real. The 1970s feminist and anarchist revival brought her back into the spotlight, and her writing started circulating again. Books like Living My Life and collections like Red Emma Speaks. That's when we got a now famous quote attributed to her. "If I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution." She probably never said it exactly like that, but it sums up her spirit perfectly. Joy and rebellion are not mutually exclusive. To mark 50 years since her death, the Emma Goldman Papers Project launched an exhibit honoring her life and legacy, complete with letters, photos, official government documents, and press clippings that showed just how powerful and polarizing she really was. They even had her deportation warrant and her letters to Margaret Sanger on display. She didn't disappear as just another dissident. She left behind a legacy, a blueprint even. But let's take a step back and see where this all started. Emma Goldman was born in 1869 in what's now Lithuania, but back then it was part of the Russian Empire. Her childhood was rough. Her father was harsh and controlling, and her mother worn down and emotionally distant, offering her very little support. Emma was defiant from the start, and she paid the price for it, often literally, with whippings from her father. Her only real comfort came from her half-sister Helena, who gave her the love and care she wasn't getting anywhere else. Those early years were marked by pain, poverty, and control, but also moments that shaped her sense of justice. When she was still young, she lived in a village called Papile, where she had her first tender experiences with a household servant named Petrushka. But even more defining was something she witnessed: a peasant being whipped in public. That image stayed with her for her whole life, fueling her hatred of violent authority. Later, in Königsberg, she faced cruel teachers, one who beat her students, another who tried to take advantage of the girls. But she also found encouragement from a kind language teacher who introduced her to books, ideas, and even opera. She passed the entrance exam for a prestigious school, but was blocked from attending when a religion teacher refused to sign off on her character. And I mean, honestly, how often do we hear that well-behaved women rarely make history? Emma Goldman lived that truth before it was even a bumper sticker. So after her turbulent childhood, Emma ended up in St. Petersburg. And if you thought things were going to get easier, they didn't. Her father, still very much clinging to the idea of a traditional future, refused to let her pursue further education and instead tried to marry her off at 15 years old. Yeah, 15. Goldman, not surprisingly, wasn't having it. She was already captivated by radical literature, especially the writings of reformers and revolutionaries, people who dared to challenge the empire and the systems that kept people crushed. And then something happened, something vague in the historical record, but unmistakable in tone. A violent encounter in a hotel room. You don't need to read between the lines too hard to know what that was. It cemented her deep mistrust of traditional power dynamics between men and women, and it lit an even bigger fire in her to live freely and on her own terms. That combination of intellectual hunger and personal violation helped shape a lifelong defiance of any system that tried to trap or silence her. By 1885, she was done. She wanted out of Russia, and her sister Helena was heading to New York. Emma begged to go. Her father said no, and she threatened to throw herself into the Neva River, and that got his attention. Begrudgingly, he allowed it. Emma and Helena landed at Castle Garden in New York and headed to Rochester, where their sister Lena already lived. It wasn't glamorous. Emma got a job sewing overcoats 10 hours a day for a couple of dollars a week. She asked for a raise, was denied, and quit on principle. At the next job, she met Jacob Kirschner, a fellow worker who shared her love of books and general dissatisfaction with factory life. They got married in early 1887, but the relationship quickly broke down. There were emotional and physical incompatibilities, jealousy, threats, none of it good. Meanwhile, Emma had her eye on bigger things. She was becoming more and more engaged in anarchist politics, especially after hearing about the Haymarket Affair, where, as we discussed previously, labor protesters in Chicago were killed and anarchists were scapegoated. The injustice of it pulled her in hard. Her marriage collapsed within the year, and after a failed reconciliation and being labeled loose by her own family for walking away from it, Emma did what she'd go on to do for the rest of her life. She left. With $5 and a sewing machine, she moved to New York City to start over. And that first day in New York changed everything. She walked into Saks Cafe, a hangout for radicals, and met two men who would shape her path. One was Alexander Berkman, who became her partner in both politics and love. The other was Johann Most, a firebrand anarchist who mentored her in the art of public speaking. Most was intense. He believed in propaganda of the deed, which is a fancy way of saying political violence to shock people into revolution. He told Emma she'd take over when he was gone, no pressure. Her first speech was in Rochester. She stood on stage, blanked out, and then something in her cracked wide open. She poured out her rage and heartbreak, her factory days, her failed marriage, the violence of the system, and the audience felt it. That's when she knew she had a voice, and she was going to use it. She quickly grew past Most's influence. He wanted to control her message, and she wasn't interested in being anyone's puppet. After a fiery break with him, she joined a new publication, Die Autonome, and moved in with Berkman and a few close friends. Their romantic relationship was complicated. Emma wasn't into sharing, and Berkman believed in free love. But politically, they were locked in. In 1892, they tried running an ice cream shop in Massachusetts, but fate had other plans. That same year, the Homestead strike exploded. Workers at Carnegie's steel plant in Pennsylvania were locked out after failed negotiations. When strikebreakers were brought in under Pinkerton guard protection, the workers fought back. It turned into a bloody showdown that left people dead. The press covered it non-stop. Emma and Sasha saw it as a defining moment. They believed that assassinating Henry Clay Frick, the ruthless manager who oversaw the lockout and hired the guards, might spark a larger uprising. Berkman would carry out the attempt, and Emma would explain the political reasoning behind it. She even considered sex work to raise the money for the cause. But the story goes that a man picked her up, gave her $10, and basically told her, "This ain't for you." She asked her sister for help instead. Berkman shot Frick multiple times and stabbed him. But Frick survived. The workers didn't rise up. Instead, Berkman was beaten nearly to death, arrested, and sentenced to 22 years. Emma, suspected as an accomplice, was harassed and evicted, but never formally charged. The anarchist movement itself turned on the idea of assassination as strategy. When Johann Most publicly criticized Berkman, Emma, never one to sit quietly, brought a toy horsewhip to one of his lectures and cracked it across his face. She later said it was impulsive and something a 23-year-old would do in the heat of fury. A year later, in 1893, the U.S. plunged into one of its worst economic crises. Unemployment soared, poverty spread, and Emma started giving speeches again, this time to angry, hungry crowds. One rally in Union Square drew about 3,000 people. Her message was simple. If they won't give you work or bread, take the bread. Authorities claimed she incited a riot. She was arrested in Philadelphia a week later. On the train ride back to New York, a detective offered to drop the charges if she turned informant. She responded the only way Emma Goldman would, with a glass of ice water to his face. Even though the public was mostly hostile and the courts were stacked against her, Emma Goldman had some unlikely support during her first major trial. Nellie Bly, yes, that Nellie Bly, the journalist who went undercover in asylums and made headlines for her guts, called Emma a modern Joan of Arc. But it wasn't enough to sway the jury. They weren't judging her actions, they were judging her politics, and the politics scared them. Emma was convicted of inciting a riot and sentenced to a year in prison. Now you'd think that would knock the wind out of her, but prison actually gave Emma new tools. She worked in the infirmary, she got some informal training as a nurse, and spent the rest of her time devouring books. Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman. When she was released after 10 months, a crowd of thousands met her at the Thalia Theater in New York like she was a returning hero, because to many she was. But Emma wasn't satisfied just stirring people up. She wanted deep knowledge and real skills, so she left the country to study midwifery in Vienna, got certified, and came back to the U.S. ready to deliver babies by day and speak truth to power by night. That pretty much became her rhythm. Care work and revolution, hand in hand. In 1900, she helped organize an international anarchist congress in France and returned to the States with Czech anarchist Hippolyte Havel. They lived and worked together in Chicago, surrounded by a network of fellow radicals. Then, in 1901, the world turned upside down again. President William McKinley was shot by an unemployed factory worker named Leon Czolgosz. He claimed to be an anarchist and said he was inspired by a speech Emma gave. Now, Czolgosz wasn't part of Emma's inner circle. She'd met him once, briefly, and thought he might have even been a spy. But his connection to her, no matter how thin, gave authorities just enough excuse to crack down. Emma was arrested again, along with about a dozen others. She was interrogated for 2 weeks, held under what they called third degree, but no real evidence surfaced. Czolgosz had acted alone, and eventually Emma was released. Still, she refused to publicly condemn him. She didn't support what he did, but she saw his actions as the product of a brutal system that breaks people. Calling him a supersensitive being, she criticized her peers for abandoning him. The press, of course, went full frenzy. They labeled her the High Priestess of Anarchy, and President Roosevelt responded to the assassination with a full-on assault on anarchist movements. Even those who merely sympathized with anarchist ideas were considered dangerous. Czolgosz was executed for the assassination of McKinley. And then, in 1903, the U.S. passed the Anarchist Exclusion Act, banning anarchists from even entering the country. That hit a nerve. To her, it wasn't just about immigrants, it was about free speech, about policing ideas. When a British anarchist named John Turner was arrested under the new law and threatened with deportation, Goldman joined forces with the Free Speech League to fight it. They brought in heavy hitters, Clarence Darrow, Edgar Lee Masters, and took it all the way to the Supreme Court. They lost, but Emma saw it as a win in terms of public awareness. The trial put a spotlight on how easily political dissidents could be branded as criminal. But activism was taking its toll. Emma wrote to Berkman that she felt like public property, worn out by the pressure of constantly fighting for other people's freedoms. So she pivoted, again, and did something creative with it. In 1906, she launched Mother Earth, a radical magazine that became a lifeline for anarchist and progressive voices. The magazine tackled everything: politics, art, labor, love, sex, and spirituality. It ran work from global thinkers like Kropotkin, Nietzsche, Wollstonecraft, and Proudhon, alongside Emma's own essays. It became a community on paper, a movement you could hold in your hands. From there, Emma hit the road hard. For the next decade, she traveled the country giving lectures, stirring up conversation, and according to government spies, packing every room she entered. Her presence was electric. Artists, judges, laborers, journalists, they all came to hear what she had to say. And in 1908, she fell for a guy named Ben Reitman, sometimes called the Hobo Doctor. He'd grown up rough, spent time drifting, and eventually became a physician, offering care to the people society didn't want to see: sex workers, the poor, the sick. Reitman and Goldman were both believers in free love, and in practice, though, That got messy. He had multiple lovers, but she stayed loyal. She wanted to live by her principles, but she was still human, and jealousy crept in. Around that time, Emma started feeling like her audiences were just coming to be entertained, not educated. So she published Anarchism and Other Essays in 1910, a collection of talks and articles she hoped would challenge people to think deeper. She was also one of the few people speaking openly about contraception and reproductive rights. Long before it was mainstream, Emma was teaching women how to take control of their bodies. She supported Margaret Sanger's early work, even when it landed both of them in jail. In 1916, Emma was arrested under the Comstock laws for giving a public lecture on birth control. She refused to pay the fine and spent 2 weeks in a workhouse. She didn't resent it. She called it an opportunity to reconnect with the people society had thrown away. And just when she thought it couldn't get more intense, war broke out. President Wilson had won re-election with the promise to keep the U.S. out of war. Then he sent the country straight into World War I. Congress passed the Selective Service Act of 1917, requiring men to register for the draft. Emma saw the war and the draft as pure capitalist militarism. She made her position clear in Mother Earth. Together with Berkman, now out of prison, she founded the No Conscription League. It was anti-war, anti-capitalist, and totally unapologetic. The group spread quickly, and the government cracked down just as fast. Even progressive groups backed away, unwilling to fight the war machine. But Emma, she doubled down. Pamphlets, rallies, organizing, she wasn't going to stop. In June 1917, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were arrested again, this time under the Espionage Act for encouraging men to resist the draft during World War I. At trial, Emma didn't back down. She defended their actions as an exercise of free speech, calling out the hypocrisy of a country claiming to defend democracy overseas while silencing dissidents at home. It didn't matter. They were both sentenced to 2 years in prison, fined $10,000 each, and warned that deportation was likely once their sentences were served. While locked up, Emma worked as a seamstress and found a bit of solidarity behind bars. She connected with other political prisoners, socialist Kate Richards O'Hare and fellow anarchist Gabriella Segata Antolini, and together the three women pushed for better prison conditions. They became known as the Trinity, a tiny resistance inside prison walls. Emma was released in September 1919, but the next chapter would hit even harder. The U.S. was deep in the grip of the Red Scare, panic over communism, labor strikes, and immigrant activism. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and a young J. Edgar Hoover were chomping at the bit to purge the country of so-called radicals, and Emma Goldman was target number 1. Hoover called her one of the, quote, most dangerous anarchists in America. At her deportation hearing, Emma argued that she couldn't be deported. She was a U.S. citizen by marriage. But the government pointed out that her ex-husband had lost his own citizenship years earlier, nullifying hers in the process. She thought about fighting it in court, but ultimately chose not to. So on December 21st, 1919, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were among 249 people loaded onto a ship called the Buford, nicknamed the Soviet Ark, and deported to Finland. From there, they were escorted to the Russian border. Newspapers across the U.S. cheered as if they'd won something, but for Emma, this was only the beginning of another disillusionment. At first, she was hopeful about the Bolshevik Revolution. Even though she was wary of centralized power, she believed the revolution might usher in real human freedom and economic justice. But when she arrived in Petrograd, her hope began to unravel fast. A party official casually dismissed free speech as bourgeois superstition. And what she witnessed across the country horrified her. Corruption, censorship, brutal labor conditions. People who questioned the government weren't just ignored, they were treated like enemies. And when she and Berkman confronted Lenin about it directly, he told them there would be no free speech in a revolutionary period. Berkman tried for a while to explain it all away as necessary sacrifice, but even he couldn't keep up the illusion. Things boiled over in 1921 when workers began striking in Petrograd and Kronstadt. The state responded with force. Thousands were killed or imprisoned. Emma and Sasha had seen enough. "We can do nothing here," she wrote. In December of that year, they left Russia devastated and politically transformed. They landed in Berlin, where Goldman wrote a series of articles for the New York World about what she had seen. Those became My Disillusionment in Russia and My Further Disillusionment in Russia. The titles weren't her choice. Her publishers slapped them on for impact, but they weren't wrong either. Her faith in the Soviet experiment was shattered. Still, life in Berlin wasn't much easier. Communists now viewed her as a traitor, liberals thought she was too extreme, and Goldman found herself politically homeless. By 1924, she moved to London, but even there she ran into backlash. When she criticized Soviet repression at a dinner hosted by author Rebecca West with guests like H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, the room went cold. Russell later wrote her off as a dreamy idealist, and when deportation loomed once again, a Scottish anarchist named James Colton stepped in with a solution: marriage. They weren't close, but Goldman agreed, gaining British citizenship and for a while a little peace of mind. But she still felt isolated. Her lectures on drama didn't land. Her second book didn't come together, and she confessed in letters that she was lonely and tired. In 1927, she was in Canada when she learned that Sacco and Vizzenti, two Italian anarchists wrongly convicted of murder, were about to be executed. It gutted her. It brought back the ghosts of Haymarket, and she felt too far away to do anything. The grief lit a fire, though. She turned to her own story and began writing her autobiography, Living My Life. American supporters, including H.L. Mencken and Edna St. Vincent Millay, raised money to help her. She holed up in a small cottage in Saint-Tropez and poured her soul onto the page. Berkman gave her feedback, some of it harsh, and the process strained their relationship. She had wanted the book to be affordable for workers, but her publisher split it into 2 expensive volumes. Still, reviews were glowing. Critics called it one of the best nonfiction books of the year. In 1934, Goldman was allowed back into the U.S., but only to lecture on drama and her own life, not politics. She accepted the terms and returned briefly to New York. The reception was warm, though the communist press froze her out. After her visa expired, she returned to Canada, continuing to write and correspond with friends and comrades. In 1936, her world tilted again. Berkman, struggling with illness and despair, took his own life. Emma rushed to Nice to be by his side, but she was too late. The grief was immeasurable. Then something unexpected happened. The Spanish Civil War broke out, and anarchists in Spain weren't just resisting, they were winning. The revolution lit a spark in Emma she hadn't felt in years. She was invited to Barcelona by the anarchist groups CNT and FAI, and for the first time she lived in a community that operated on pure anarchist principles. "In all my life," she said, "I have not met with such warm hospitality, comradeship, and solidarity." She toured collectives, edited English bulletins, and told Spanish workers that their revolution shattered the myth that anarchism leads to chaos. But soon the cracks began to show. The anarchists joined a coalition government, an unthinkable move for Goldman, who had always rejected state power. Worse, the communists demanded more control, and Soviet aid came with strings attached. As propaganda campaigns painted the anarchists as enemies, Goldman grew increasingly alarmed. She returned to London to rally support, writing regularly for Spain and the world and defending the movement against lies and smear tactics. When she went back to Spain in late 1937, the revolution was collapsing. Communists had turned on their former allies, international support had dried up, and Franco was closing in. Disheartened, Goldman turned to London, then left for Canada in 1939. But the anarchists in Spain hadn't forgotten her. On her 70th birthday, CNT leader Mariano Vasquez sent a tribute calling her their spiritual mother. Goldman said it was the greatest honor of her life. Even as World War II loomed, Emma remained true to her anti-war stance. She hated fascism, Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Franco, but didn't believe the so-called democracies were any better. "I will not support a war for the democracies," she wrote, "because they are only fascist in disguise." In February 1940, Emma suffered a massive stroke. It left her unable to speak, a brutal blow for one of history's greatest orators. A few months later, she suffered another stroke and passed away on May 14, 1940, in Toronto. She was 70 years old. Though she'd been exiled, the U.S. government allowed her remains to return. She was buried in Forest Home Cemetery outside Chicago, near the Haymarket martyrs who had ignited her radical fire all those years ago. Her grave bears the inscription, "Liberty will not descend to a people. A people must raise themselves to liberty." And dang if she didn't spend her whole life doing just that. Let's talk a little bit about her influences and philosophy. Emma Goldman wasn't shaped by just one school of thought. She pulled from a wide spectrum of radical and literary voices. Bakunin gave her fire. Thoreau, Emerson, and Chernyshevsky stirred her conscience. Kropotkin offered a vision of mutual aid that made practical sense. Wollstonecraft gave her feminist backbone. And then there was Nietzsche, the one she called a rebel and a poet, not a theorist. She didn't buy into every word he wrote, but she admired his spirit, uncompromising, untamed, aristocratic in the soul, not in the wallet. For Goldman, philosophy was never about orthodoxy. It was about lived experience. If it couldn't move through your body and relationships, it didn't belong in your politics. As far as her anarchism, Goldman's wasn't just theoretical. It was spiritual, sensual, deeply human. To her, it meant freeing the mind from religious fear, the body from capitalist exploitation, and our lives from government meddling. She envisioned a society built on voluntary cooperation and shared resources, not control. Anarchism, for her, was as much about joy and self-expression as it was about justice and resistance. As far as violence and revolution, in her early days, Goldman believed that dramatic targeted violence, what anarchists called propaganda of the deed, could shake people awake. She supported Berkman's attempt on Henry Clay Frick, and while she didn't outright endorse the assassination of President McKinley, she understood it as an inevitable reaction to systemic brutality. But Russia changed her. There, she saw what happened when revolution calcified into state terror. She never disavowed the idea that revolutions involve violence, but she drew a hard line between temporary resistance and permanent repression. Once violence becomes the system, she warned, you've already lost the revolution. As far as capitalism, Goldman saw it as a meat grinder. It didn't just exploit workers, it hollowed them out. People became cogs, lives became labor. Everything was reduced to its profit value. She once thought small reforms were distractions, crumbs tossed to pacify people. But an older man at one of her lectures challenged her. He asked whether the fight for 2 fewer hours a day was meaningless just because full revolution might not come in his lifetime. That moment cracked something open. She didn't stop fighting for the big picture, but she became more supportive of labor movements that aimed to ease suffering in the short term too. And this is something that I have personally struggled with. I support the idea of unions because they're necessary in our society, but the real goal, the primary goal, needs to be crafting a society where unions aren't necessary. The idea that we have predatory capitalist practices that require unions to exist should be abhorrent. As far as the state, suffrage, and systems of control, to Goldman, the state was never neutral. It was a machine built for domination. Voting, she argued, gave people an illusion of power, while the real decisions were made elsewhere. That's why she didn't get behind women's suffrage movements. She didn't think adding women to a broken system would fix it. As she put it, if the system itself is corrupt, you're not cleaning it up by changing who's at the table. You're just serving the same meal with different waitstaff. She held the same skeptical eye towards Zionism and prisons. Whether it was a homeland or a jailhouse, if it was built to control, Goldman didn't trust it. When it came to war and free speech, few things enraged her more than war, and especially the draft. She saw conscription as the state literally claiming ownership over people's bodies, forcing them to kill and die for corporate profit and nationalist lies. Her anti-draft work during World War I is what landed her in prison and eventually got her deported. But her legacy in this area runs even deeper. Goldman was a fierce defender of free speech, not as some abstract right, but as the bedrock of any real movement for change. She put her body on the line for it. In San Diego, in 1912, she and her partner, Ben Reitman, faced violence from vigilantes for refusing to shut up. They didn't cave, and that courage inspired people like Roger Baldwin, who went on to help found the ACLU. Emma Goldman didn't just preach freedom of speech, she lived it, bled for it, and built its foundations in America. And if you've heard some of my podcasts on free speech, you kind of know my position on that. There is no such thing as free speech. There is only speech, those who have it and those who do not. So make of that what you will. I'm not going to say that I don't value the idea of free speech, but we have to be very careful, I think, about what we define that as. As far as feminism and sexuality, Goldman was way ahead of her time on this one. She didn't fit comfortably into first-wave feminism. She thought it was too focused on getting women a seat at a table instead of flipping the damn thing over. To her, women's liberation wasn't about voting or career success within a male-dominated system. It was about full autonomy, financial, emotional, sexual, and intellectual. She wanted women to be able to support themselves, choose their partners freely, or not at all, and have access to birth control so they could make choices about motherhood. As a nurse, she educated women about contraception and saw abortion as a preventable tragedy brought on by poverty and ignorance, not moral failure. And when it came to sexuality, she wasn't just radical, she was revolutionary. At a time when even anarchists weren't talking about gay rights, Goldman stood up and said that love between people of the same sex wasn't unnatural or immoral, it was human. She was the first American to defend same-sex love openly and passionately in public, and she paid for it with arrests, harassment, and public condemnation. She never flinched. As far as her atheism, Goldman didn't mince words about religion. She saw it as another tool in the authoritarian toolkit, used to scare people into submission with threats of hell and promises of heaven. She especially took aim at Christianity, which she viewed as propping up oppressive social systems and keeping people docile. Her atheism wasn't just about disbelieving in God, it was about freeing people's minds from inherited fear. To her, real spiritual power came from knowledge, courage, and the refusal to kneel. During her lifetime, Emma Goldman was one of the most polarizing figures in America. Some saw her as a beacon of radical truth, others as a dangerous threat to everything they held sacred. Hoover called her one of the most dangerous women in America, and she wore that like a badge. But after her death, her name faded from public memory for a while. Mainstream history books pushed her to the margins, portraying her as a loud voice, not a deep thinker. That started to shift in the 1970s. As feminism reemerged and anarchism found new life in counterculture, people rediscovered Emma Goldman, and they found someone who'd already been saying what they were just starting to figure out. Books like Living My Life and Read Emma Speaks reintroduced her to the world. That now famous quote, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution," summed up what people loved about her: fire and joy, intellect and irreverence. Even if she didn't say it word for word, it was pure Emma. Today her legacy lives on, not just in books and lectures, but in real places. The Emma Goldman Clinic in Iowa, Read Emma's bookstore in Baltimore. These are tributes in action, places built to the ideals that she lived and died for: bodily autonomy, radical love, and defiance in the face of control. Emma Goldman didn't just talk about freedom, she fought for it, she bled for it, she lived it. And in the echo of her words, in the pulse of her rebellion, she still does. So let me leave you with some final thoughts. Don't just remember her, Become the threat. Emma Goldman wasn't commemorated because she was polite. She was feared because she was effective. If her story lit something in you, don't let it smolder. Organize, agitate, resist, speak up, show up, refuse to be respectable when respect is used to silence. What's your cause? What system needs cracking? Be the disruption. Read radically. Live radically. Goldman read everything. So if you're moved, don't stop here. Pick up a copy of Living My Life. Get into Anarchism and Other Essays. Read My Disillusionment in Russia. Then hand that book to someone else and talk about it. Build the chain. You don't have to adopt anarchism if it's not your thing, but be curious, learn, and check out more reading selections in the description. Next, fight like Emma, in the streets and between the sheets. If you believe bodily autonomy, sexual freedom, and worker solidarity go hand in hand, you're in Emma's lineage. Support local labor actions, show up at reproductive justice rallies, donate to your local abortion fund. And when someone tells you dancing makes you unserious, turn up the volume. Support the radicals keeping her legacy alive. Check out places like Red Emma's Bookstore Coffee House or the Emma Goldman Clinic. Buy your next book or t-shirt from someone who gives a damn. Start your own radical space if you don't see one. Or keep listening, keep questioning, keep raising hell. If this episode stirred you, don't let the fire fade. Subscribe, share the episode, leave a review that scares the algorithm. And if there's a woman, past or present, who shook the system and never got her due, let me know in comments. She might just be the next story I bring to light. That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring experience and meaning in individuals and the broader society. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these talks, and in the meantime, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.